Hello everyone, welcome to Super Jumbo. Today we're going to be looking at the Sheet Issues and Revisions tool within the Autodesk Revit platform. This video will specifically deal with some shortcomings that the tool has and will introduce a workaround that allows future flexibility and multiple different path tracking. I'm really excited to bring this video as the first on the channel, so if this is of interest to you, please stay tuned. This video is going to be an in-depth guide showing you everything about how to make this happen, why it's happening, and really the ins and outs of what's going on. It is not a quick little tutorial. If you're just here to try to understand more about different path tracking, go ahead and use the chapter guide below to jump right ahead to the how to different path tracking. That's going to be where we implement the new workaround that you're going to be most interested in. Let's say you've got a sheet list. The sheet list in this example is A101, 102, 201. And your sheet list itself will tell you when you've submitted a drawing. So here we show that the first submission has all of the sheets checked as if they were issued for that submission. Now, for our purposes, think of this submission as 100% SD, 100% CDs, whatever you want to think of it as. Now, maybe your sheet list grows over time and you add in a couple of 300 series sheets and those get issued in the second submission. So maybe this is your 100% CDs and the first submission was DD and you didn't actually need to issue all the drawings. Well, then as time goes on, you of course maybe have a third submission. And in this case, maybe it's, an addendum or a bulletin, something post 100% CDs where you're updating drawings, capturing design changes, whatever it is. Well, this brings up the idea of what a conformed set is. Now, a conformed set is an artificial set. And a conformed set, what it actually is it takes the latest version of each sheet and it compiles it into a set. So this is an artificial set. It's not a set that you'll ever print. However, it is essentially the set that the GC or builder or whoever you're giving drawings to needs to have at the site in order to make sure that they have the latest versions of all the drawings. They can't in this example just have the third submission because they'd be missing 3 sheets. They can't have the second submission because that wouldn't actually contain the most updated sheets for A102 or A302. Now, a quick note here is that I wrote in the right hand there 2, 3, 2, 2, 3 for what version of the drawing it is. That actually will correspond to the number of first submission, second submission, or third submission. It does not refer to the number of times that drawing has been issued. You can clearly see here that the last drawing, or the last sheet, A302, is actually 3 for the third submission, but it has been issued twice. So just a quick clarification on that. Now, if you want to learn more about conformed sets or have a diagram that you can share, please feel free to visit Arc Overflow. There we do have a little bit more detailed information on it. Now, as time goes on, you might have, of course, what's next? A fourth submission. And that fourth submission means that you will update your conformed set. And the fifth submission, you would, of course, update the conformed set. So here we go, and let's, for our purposes, stop here with 5 submissions. And let's see what we have. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 submissions here in a grid, and we can see here in the middle, this is actually showing us our history. However, on the right side, the conformed set only shows us the latest version. Now, the conformed set is what we actually are able to do with the Revit Issues and Revisions tool currently. We can schedule the current revision typically being the sheet that you are currently issuing or the latest version of that sheet. Now, this is baked into the Revit file, so why wouldn't we use this? Why can't we just all of a sudden start utilizing this, and why is this video even existing? Well, when we think about what this conformed set really is telling us, is it's leaving out a lot of information. it's only telling us the latest version of that sheet and nothing about its history of that sheet. So in the case of perhaps an A302 sheet, you might have a GC or a subcontractor or an owner look at that sheet and say, wait, when did this pop up onto there? Or, you know what, we forgot to bid on that. Or is this new or is it not new? Now, there's extra belts and suspenders way that we communicate that with revision clouds and especially on the Titleblock. However, for a large overview of all of the sheets, what you typically want and what's industry standard is to be able to see the history of that sheet when it was issued. This A302 sheet, you can see it was first issued in the second submission, and it's actually been updated every single submission since then. That's important knowledge for anyone who's looking at the drawings for a little bit more information, or potentially is trying to unravel something about where decisions were made, when things changed, all of that. This is what we're going to be accomplishing today. We're going to be taking the built-in sheet list schedule type, and we're going to be expanding its ability to not just show essentially the current revision of every single sheet, but we're going to actually show the history of the revisions of the sheet, utilizing a shared parameter that our consultants would be able to tie into as well. Now, quick note. One thing that's not really being discussed here is when I said first, second, third is submission and whatnot, I was saying as if they were all architectural submissions, 50% SD, 100% SD, DD, CDs, etc. But that's not the reality of projects, especially nowadays where things are kind of getting more and more truncated. Clients are expecting fast track bid submissions and permit sets and all these things. So typically any one type of project, and for maybe a small scale residential architect, this might not be so true, but for any sort of really work in an urban area, especially where I'm used to practicing like New York City, you're going to have to be juggling multiple different submission tracks. What I mean by that is maybe your first submission, track 1, is an architectural submission. It's 100% SD. And then you in your office treat, for example, a bid set as a different submission track because that's a different liability on the firm and on the drawing sets. So maybe your next submission is actually, what some would call maybe a 50% DD, but for you it's a DD pricing set. Or maybe it's your first submission to the village or town board, or it's even maybe an investor presentation deck. Who knows what it is, but this is just illustrating that there are different tracks that the project takes throughout this process. So if we go back and we apply that to the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, you can see right here in the first 5, what we're illustrating is 3 separate submission tracks. Those submission tracks can be very complicated to manage, and a lot of the times where you think you might have our next submission is going to be architectural, it's going to be on this date. Well, especially as we've seen through the pandemic, as well as inflation and financing changes, things change frequently. So what we need to do is we need to build a system that can not only serve as providing the history of the sheets, but also allows you to simultaneously make any of your next submissions change on the fly. So that's what we're going to be doing, because really what it ultimately comes down to is this is one small component to the drawing set. And the drawing set itself is our communication tool we have to the GCs, to the builders, to the subcontractors, whoever is building it, pricing it, working with this set in order to deliver the project for the owner. And for us, it's, you really need to make sure that we're communicating things in the most effective way possible. All right, so I've got the Autodesk Basic Sample Revit project open. This is the Revit 2019 version. Everything that I'm talking about is consistent all the way up through Revit 2023 as of the recording of this. So let's go ahead and this will be the project that we end up using throughout many different tutorials. So let's start to clean it up a little bit. So this is actually just a little help icon and some help locations and reviewing things. I'm going to delete that so that this will give us space to put our sheet list. Now, there actually isn't a sheet list in the project right now. Even though there's a title sheet and site plan and some sheets, there actually isn't one created for us. So let's go ahead and create a new sheet list. And what we're going to schedule is going to be the number and the name. Number normally comes first. And then in terms of scheduling, what revision we're on or whatnot, you can see that we really only have the option to schedule the current revision. So let's go ahead and schedule that. And I'm actually going to also schedule the description just for helping explain the process right now. Let's go ahead, and then for sorting, we will sort by sheet number. Click OK. And so here's our sheet list, and I'm going to plop it onto this first sheet here just so that we have it here. So right here we can see we've got in the basic project, we've got 6 different sheets, and then we also have no actual current revision or current revision descriptions applied to any of these sheets. So what does that mean? Well, what we're talking about, the current revision, is, as we talked about with the Conformed set earlier, is that's what we're talking about Revit's ability to do. This current revision and the description is tied to, under View, the Revisions tool. So if we go and open up the Sheet Issues/Revisions tool, you can see currently there's only one revision on it, and that's because, we haven't published this, we haven't submitted it for anything in this theoretical sample project. So there is no real history there yet or anything like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just make this a fake date. Let's put it in the past sometime. And we'll call it 100% schematic design. And normally this is, 100% schematic design is not something you would normally number as a revision number, but this revision number is what will show up here. So I'm going to leave that on so that we can see it. And in fact, we can do alphanumeric just to make it a little bit more clear that this wouldn't really actually be numbered. I'm going to click OK there. And now nothing still happens because we haven't actually applied that revision to any of the sheets. Now, this sheet that we're looking at is the A001, and I'm actually going to just add a dash in there. That's just a little bit of how I like to have my sheets always, is with the dash. A001, and that did, of course, knock it down to the bottom. So we'll correct the other ones later. And there's 2 different ways to actually apply a revision to a sheet. Now, for something like 100% schematic design, you typically, before 100% CDs are never actually bubbling anything. So one of the ways is the bubble tool, which would be under Annotate, Revision Cloud. And as long as you cloud on the actual revision that you're on, and remember we only have one, so only one shows up here. And as soon as we place it there, you'll see that this revision shows up in the title block. Now notice if I delete this, that'll go away right there almost immediately. So if I undo that, what we can also see is not only did it keep it right there in the title block, but you'll see it also popped up right here. And this is what we're trying to basically establish, is how to get this all to show up. So that's one way. Now, as I said, 100% schematic designs, you're not really, well, hopefully, you're not bubbling anything. I know a lot of architects have their own ways to do things, but typically you're not bubbling anything before 100% CDs, and that includes 100% CDs should not be bubbled. You typically only need to bubble things after it's a 100% CD set or a permit set or updates in such that would affect, liability legally or buying, all that stuff. So if we aren't able to really bubble for this, well, what can we do? Well, one way would, of course, a workaround would be you can bubble. You can just tell it not to ever show the bubbles under Done. You can click OK and it'll disappear. That's a little bit of a, it's a workaround. I don't like the idea of having more bubbles I say bubbles, clouds, they're all the same thing. Bubbles or clouds in the file than we need to, because you will eventually get thousands and thousands of these on larger projects. So I'm going to delete that. The other way is just to manually apply it right through this toolbar, Revisions on Sheet. So if we click Revisions on Sheet, we can check it and we can click it and show it up. Now, one of the interesting things is if you ever go to the revisions on sheet, notice how it was empty before, and then I clicked it to yes, and see how it's a normal look. Now, if I uncheck that and I add back in the bubble, oops, I'm going to go to annotate revision cloud, and I'm going to bubble. And notice how even before I placed the bubble, it already added it. You can see it already added it right there, and already added it over on the side. And a quick note is that you can bubble in the sheet or within a view that is on the sheet. Now, what I always tell people, 99 times out of 100, you should be bubbling in the view. You want the revision cloud tied to the actual view. Times when you wouldn't want to bubble in the view are, you know, maybe for rendering purposes. You added this rendering to the page, or you're adding the page all together. Some people like to bubble the entire page. Some people just bubble down here, you know, just state that that's a new page. There's various reasons why you'd need to bubble in a sheet as opposed to a view, but 99 times out of 100, you'd want to bubble in the view. Now, if I do click the bubble and I click OK, what you should see now under revisions is that it got checked, but notice how it's a gray checkbox. So I can't uncheck that. And that's because that check is being controlled by the bubble. So therefore, in order to get rid of that, I need to click this, delete this, now come back in here, and you can see that it's not there anymore. So that now applies it to there. Now let's go ahead and just add in one more revision. And I'm going to add in a date after the one that I just did. And let's call it 100% design development. Click OK. And now let's add that to not only this sheet. So let's go ahead and click OK. And notice this is where really that conform set, the issues with the current tool exist. This is our sheet list, and notice how it just lost the history of this sheet being issued. Now, the sheet itself has the history. That's kind of the interesting part, is that there is, you know, obviously Revit has that data stored, and there are schedule types within the title block that are able to access that data. However, the sheet list schedule cannot access that data. So notice how if we go here and we add it to another one, on this A103 sheet, we just added it, but now it looks the exact same. So this is exactly what we're talking about. So what I'm going to do in a second is I'm going to actually just kind of pause, fast forward through the video, and we'll add in all of the revisions. I'm going to rename some of these sheets to match what our example was in the previous, you know, couple of minutes of our tutorial. And we'll be able to then essentially look at how to set up the process beyond this. All right, so what I've done is I renamed all of the sheet numbers to not only include that little dash that's a personal preference of mine, but also to rename them closer to what we had in our example. So the one exception being the fact that we didn't have an A001 title sheet. So you'll see these 5 will match up to the numbers. The other thing that I did is under view revisions, I added in all of the 5 different issuances we had. If you remember, and I'll post up on the screen right now, is that we had 5 issuances and 5 sheets. And so what I then did is I applied the correct history of the revisions to each of the sheets. Now, you don't have to actually open up the sheet to do that if you're just using the revisions on sheets. You can actually just click through as I'm doing right now, and you'll see it changes the sheet in the properties right here, which you can then do revisions on sheet, and you can do this. So what you'll see right here is because, and what I'm going to do right now is I'll switch this to numeric so that all of these represent, and I think I could change them all at once. You'll see that these represent the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, similar to what we were looking at, first, second, third, fourth, etc. And so what you'll see here is we've got current revision for really the first sheet that we care about is this A101 is 5, 4, 5, 2, 5, which you'll see matches exactly what we said the conformed set was. So this is illustrating the fact that you are able to, and you know, maybe for your office, this is all that you need. Maybe this is exactly what you want, knowing that the history of each revision is still on the sheets themselves. So we can open up, let's say, this A302 sheet, and when you go over to the title block here, you can see it has the history of the revisions here. But like I said, the whole purpose of this is to introduce a new way that allows us to not just control different sheet lists for different types of submission tracks, but also the history of it. So that's going to be the next section. And the other thing that we really have to do to prep for that is we need to create a shared parameters file under manage. Manage shared parameters, and either browse to your company's shared parameters file, which really there should only be one per project, or create a new one right here. And you'll see there's nothing in here. So we'll go through in the next video exactly how to start implementing all of the changes. All right, let's get going with the workaround. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using shared parameters, mapping those shared parameters to a project parameter, which will then be tied to the sheets. This will allow a different shared parameter to represent every single different issuance we have. So let's go ahead and start with the shared parameters. And this is a completely blank file. There are a couple schools of thought on what to do with the shared parameter. So first and foremost is that you should definitely have a shared parameter file that's, you know, your office starting file. However, you should make it unique for every single project. That way each project has the ability to start with your template pieces, but then expand, continue them, and adjust them and modify them as their project needs develop. One of the things that some offices do is with the drawing list, this might be something that you share to another office, like a structural, mechanical, and of course I'm speaking from an architecture perspective. And in which case, some people don't like sharing all of the different shared parameters. So some people hold two different shared parameter files. I don't really think that's necessary. You can just, you know, it's no harm, no foul to share the entire file with them. Or worst case scenario, you can delete out different groups before sending it to them. So let's go ahead and create a new group. Now you might call this sheet issues, drawing issues, sheet list, sheet issuances. We'll just go ahead with sheet issuances. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to create a new parameter, and we want this to be a yes/no parameter. Common is fine for the discipline. So this will be the second spot that we can make a different choice with how we name things. So some offices choose to do a, you know, their acronym at the front, or just a little bit of something that signifies their office. So you know, speaking just maybe you're at Gensler, you could do GA, Gensler Architecture _ issuance 1. And now remember, even though your issuance might be 50% SD, DD, whatever, we want this to have the flexibility to really work for any single project, but also flexibility for it to change. Therefore, these have to be generically named, which can be a little bit confusing, but it actually works out to our benefit a little bit later, you'll see. So you could also do issue, issuance, submission, perhaps. It's really up to you. I'm typically used to seeing issuance, and I'm gonna do _01 just to make sure that there's no spaces in there. A personal preference of mine is to make parameters that don't have spaces in case you need to do computation with them. And under tooltip, what you can do is you can edit this. Now this is going to be the tooltip that shows up when you hover over something. So you could simply say, you know, if it was Gensler, let's say Gensler Architecture shared parameter, and you can say you know, issuance 1. Now I'm going to actually create this one, and we'll just be able to then see what it looks like in the file, and then we'll come back in and we'll actually delete it and rename everything how we want them to be named. So let's go ahead and click OK, and click OK. Now I create a shared parameter, but I haven't mapped that shared parameter. So what we're going to do is we're going to come to project parameters. We're going to add a project parameter. And what we're actually going to do is we're going to not create a new project parameter, but we're going to create a shared parameter. And what we're actually doing here is we have to select the shared parameter, and we only have one, which is this guy, issuance 1. And you'll see it populates some data right here. This will be all automatically filled out based on what your shared parameter was set up to be. And then the group under parameter under, this will group it under one of these gray bars right here for your sheet. So we can really put it under whatever we wanted. If we wanted it to be grouped with all this information, we could put it under identity data. I typically don't like that, as there's just already so much stuff there. I normally go with either data or other, or some sort of other, text, title text, visibility, something else. So let's put it under data, and we need to map this to the sheets. So let's go ahead and go to S and then sheets, and click OK. And then once we click OK, you'll see it populate in here. So there you go, right there under data, issuance 1. And if we highlight over it, there's where you can see the shared parameter tooltip popping in. So this issuance 1 can now exist for every single one of these sheets. And we can now, if we go back to our sheet list, we go to edit for the fields, you'll be able to see issuance 1 pops in here, because remember, we're scheduling fields from sheets, and we just applied this parameter to the sheets. And because it's a shared parameter, we're able to actually schedule that parameter. That's why it's important that it's a shared parameter. So if we go ahead and add this, click OK, what we can see is we have a checkbox here. Now, this is one of those things about Revit that's a little frustrating, because this is a yes/no parameter, but this value that it has in it isn't really a yes/no parameter. It's a null value. So this null value isn't yes and it isn't no, even though it looks like a yes because there is a checkbox there, which, if you remember back to our revisions on sheet, it looks similar to that. So this is going to be read as a no. If we go back to our title sheet, you can see that nothing shows up in here, but it will play in later where we're going to want to make these all no's. But you can see if I check this, maybe uncheck, check. Let's go back to the title sheet. You'll see that now we have issuance 1, yes, yes, no, no, yes, yes. So what we can do is we can essentially create issuance 1, issuance 2, issuance 3, etc. for all of the different issuances that we're going to need. Now, because this is we're going to call this like a template or a starter file, I'm going to actually just create probably 10 of them right out the gate, just so that we have all 10 of those in the file. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete out the one that we just made, because obviously this isn't Gensler or anything like that. And we're going to then create some new ones. So that'll be sped up for the next video, the next little part of the video, I should say. All right, so what we did is we just created all of our different shared parameters, all 10 of them, and then we added them into the project as project parameters that were mapped to the sheets. If you notice, one of the things that's useful with making shared parameters is you can't rename them, and you're not supposed to ever edit the shared parameters file manually ever. So it's really best to just go methodical, go slow. If you mess up, like you forget to put yes, no as the parameter type or whatnot, try to catch it early on. One of the most painstaking things is if you see in this data list how everything goes in order, if you do end up having to delete 5 and then re-putting it in, it doesn't always reinsert it in chronologically or alphabetically, I should say. It just will insert it randomly in the list. So you want to make sure these are popping in all in order, that everything is correct. And essentially, because you're creating this theoretically for your office or whatnot to be used for the future, you want it to be as perfect as possible before releasing it. So what you should be able to see here is quite a difference between what we were previously had, which is the conformed set as we introduced it right here, as well as then now a history tracking right here. So what we're going to really quickly do is we're going to go into this sheet list, and up here in the issuance, you can actually change the header here. So this is why we don't want to name it specifically what it is, because if you name it as 25% SD, 50% SD, and you think, oh, every single project of mine has those, I'll just automatically make them. Well, not every single one of your projects will follow that exact schedule or those exact deadlines, and you don't want to limit yourself that way. Instead, what you can do is you can change the header up there, or my preference is to come into here and change the header right here. Now, we should be making this match our sheet issues and revisions right here. So what this is, and this could have been something that we did, instead of writing issuance, we could have write sequence. Now, I like issuance better, but what we need to know is that the issuance 1 matches sequence 1, issuance 2 matches sequence 2, and so forth. So this title right here actually goes right here. And if we look at our title sheet, we'll see 100% schematic design right there. Now, what I'll do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to replace out all of these different headers with this. And notice how the issuance 1 over here is still issuance 1. And if I check it, see how it says yes there now? Yes. No. And that's the difference of the values, in the sense that there's null values in it right now, which are just essentially empty, or empty, null, however you want to think of it. And then there's yes and no. So this parameter, which is a yes no parameter, actually has 3 different states in it, which is very important to understand. So I'm going to go ahead and fast forward through again. I'm going to update all of these titles, and then I'm also going to go through and update all of our sheets right here to be as well updated for matching what we previously went through. All right, so we got all of that done, and what you'll see right here, a couple of things. A quick note is that you can actually add a couple of spaces just at the end of the text right here to give that a little bit more buffer room. And what you'll see down here is I updated everything. I also said that the title sheet would be issued for every single one. So I updated that both for the issuances as well as the revisions on the sheet. Now, this doesn't look terribly great. Now, you could, come in here, and there are ways to essentially color these. So what you could do is you could go under formatting, and you could go to issuance 1 and do a conditional format. If it's equal to yes, you could essentially do just a black background, which would color that all in. So that doesn't really work for no's, and it's not really an eloquent way. It'll be way too much ink in the long run, all that stuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to here. We're going to go back. We're going to actually just clear that out. And what instead we actually are going to do is we're going to create a conditional parameter, or I guess I should say a calculated parameter. And what a calculated parameter does is it allows us to take some sort of information from one parameter and apply it to a new parameter. So if I do a calculated parameter, it's going to be a formula, and what we're going to do is we're going to do a text formula. And what we're going to do is we're going to do if issuance 1, and you can just write it out or that. And then what it typically is it's an if statement, allows us to have 2 different values. So in this one, we can see, I'm just going to write out X and O. So what we're actually saying is if issuance, and we only need to write if because issuance is a yes, no parameter. The if statement is saying if, look at this parameter, if it's a yes, return out this first value, which happens to be an X. If it's not, return out an O. So let's go ahead and write this as issuance 1X. And the reason I'm doing an X is just because that's, you know, what I'm used to graphically. And we're going to move it up. And what we can do is we can make sure that this says center, make sure this says vertical. And I'm actually going to steal this header from here, and I'm going to just apply the same header there. And what we can now see is we have the schematic design, which now instead of these ugly yeses and nos, we've got X's and O's. Now, of course, X's and O's isn't really something we do. So let's go ahead and change that calculated parameter. Instead of an O, let's just make it an empty space. Click OK. And now you'll see instead of a no, we have an empty, and instead of an X, or instead of a yes, we have an X. Now, this is where also some offices, of course, decide to do bullet points. You know, and you are able to do a bullet point. I will give it, I'll give a little bit of a preview right here, just so that you can see that. Edit, calculated parameter, bullet point, click OK. I know that this is kind of more the old school way of doing it in CAD. I will say we utilized at my former offices bullet points until we ran into a corruption error. So the corruption error, we somehow, you know, in Revit land, we basically tracked it back to the only thing that had changed between literally in the last, 20 minutes from when we had it, and it was a corrupt file that crashed, was the bullet points. So we essentially just decided to shy away from bullet points after that, as we didn't really know if the program struggled with them or what it was. So I'm just going to undo that, leave it at X's. And what you can see is that this is no longer a needed column. And so what we can do here is we can go in here, formatting, and we can actually just hide that column. And now, since we've already written the formula once, and I'll write this formula in the video description so that you'll have it, we can now add a new one, a new calculated parameter, and this will be issuance _2 text. And now you need to make sure that it just looks at 2. New one. Looks at 3. Four. And lastly, we will do 5. Now let's take all of these, let's move them up into their place. And realistically, you don't even need to move these up, but I like to keep my schedules, even if these are hidden values, I like to keep the schedules well organized so that you can see there's clearly a rhythm here. And now we just need to basically copy over what we had here to here. And so, yes, you are correct. You're probably saying, oh, we didn't need to update the headings there. Correct. We did not need to, but it doesn't hurt. They're all just going to be hidden, but it doesn't really hurt too much, especially since we're just hiding them all now. Click hide. We forgot to update the alignments to all be center. Now if we go back to our title sheet, oh, we forgot one to make those vertical as well. And now all right, so here you can see this is exactly what we were trying to get. We now have just our history shown. We now have the latest version of each drawing. You can see it's matching it up because it's matched up perfectly. Now, this does introduce another level of checks that we have to do with the drawings, in the sense that we need to make sure that the sheets match up with our issuances. And that is a process, but we'll go through a couple of different strategies and tips to help you make sure that that works well. And what we'll now do in the next one is we're going to look at how do you track this and how do you change this if, going back to our example, these are not all in the order for architectural and you want to show only architectural here, or maybe only, let's just pretend like it's a permit set, only a permit set. So we'll go ahead and do that in the next part of this video. And what I'm going to do right now, just to finish this up, is we're going to come into here and we actually are going to just remove these revisions, click OK, and you can see our sheet list coming together quite nicely. Okay, so let's look back at this diagram of our sheet list and the 5 different submissions we have. Now, what we had previously shown is we were pretending like all 5 of these are, you know, part of the architectural submissions path track. But what we introduced as well in one of the previous chapters is this idea that, you know, not everything ever follows a linear path. And a lot of the times you end up having to do different submissions for different agencies or different purposes throughout the life of a project. So if we apply some reality to this, just, you know, for our example and to work with, let's pretend like this red track here is going to be our architectural issuances. And magically, we're just going to pretend like we started at 100% CDs. And magically, we also are doing our first permit set directly after that. We then have Bulletin 1 and Bulletin 2 to capture various changes. And then we actually are just going to introduce this idea of a third separate one. I'm calling it landmarks because that's a common thing in New York City, but maybe this is also something just different for you. And really what we're going to be talking about is how to orient it so that we can get these in a row. Now, the biggest issue is going to be on the title block. And if we look at this title block and we match up what we were doing, everything makes sense, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all in a row, all perfectly great. It's all very easy. But as soon as we start to think about this, well, if we were just to put these all on the title block in a row, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And a lot of this is, you know, kind of in the guise of you don't ever want to share too much information. Like in this example, I don't think you'd ever be submitting your first landmark set after, you know, 2 bulletins, but let's just say you were. Landmarks, if they saw this, would be quite upset of the fact that you've already gone to permit, you've already done all these things, like you've already gone very, very far without their input. So generally speaking, we don't want to show the history, we don't want to show more information than we need to, because a lot of the times it can just confuse, it can just muddy up the situation or the information. But instead we want to collapse it so that we can just show this. So we want to show 1, 3, 4. We don't want to show 1, 2, 3, 4. Or we just want to show 2. Or of course, just 5. So what we're talking about here is really 2 different problems. There's first the problem of the title block, which I was just showing you. And then there's also the problem of the sheet list. Now, the title block, as we talked about, that's controlled by the Issues Revisions tool, which has the revision sequence factor to it. The sheet list, we introduced a shared parameter, which is giving us that history there. Now, as we talked about, revision sequence 1 will always equal issuance 1. Revision sequence 2 always will equal issuance 2. Now, if we're thinking about how to control these various different things, let's take the sheet list, for example. The sheet list is actually pretty straightforward. It is a schedule in Revit. So what we can do is we can use the different schedule properties to essentially cut out whatever we don't want to cut out. Now you can use the filters. You could either just schedule it or not schedule it. So it's actually quite easy. We just can make a schedule that is for every single different sheet list path. We'll have like path 1, path 2, path 3. And, you know, for path 1, which is the architecture, we're not going to schedule, see, the issuance 2. It just doesn't make any sense. So that's the easy solution there. Now, if you know a little bit about how the title block works, the title block issues is actually also a schedule. But for some reason, In Revit, you're actually not allowed to really choose what you schedule, and you're not allowed to introduce any filters. It's a really weird, specific schedule and how it works. I'm sure there's some sort of coding background on how it's actually built from, on the Autodesk side. But what that means is that we can't apply the same solutions to the sheet list that we can to the title block. So if you're really watching this for the first time, this is really going to be the kind of really beautiful part of this video, and really what I think is going to help most people. There are lots of other videos out there that show you how to do the, the yes/no issuance for the sheet list history. This is going to show you how to solve the title block problem. And the way we do it is by utilizing if and conditional statements. Now, as we went through before, the way that the if statement works is that you put in a condition, and it can be conditions, and then it returns, if it's true, whatever you label there in the true setting, and if it returns it as false, whatever is false. Another way to do that is yes, no, is to think of it as yes, no. So that's what we were doing with essentially that X value. Is when it was yes, it was kind of true, and so it returned an X. When it was no, it returned just an empty space bar. So for example, if I wrote out if 1 is less than 2, X, O, and the X is in parentheses, or quotations, I should say, as well as the O, because it's text. And what we're going to see is 1 is less than 2. That's the condition. That is a true condition. Therefore, it's going to relay the true part of the statement. So it's going to label it as X. You'll be able to use these statements a lot for other things. They come in very, very handy for like family building and other things. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using a little trick where you can actually have the condition as part of your return. So what I mean by that is we can write if revision sequence equals 1, return the revision sequence. If not, empty value. And what we can do is we can actually introduce a second level there for the conditions, if, or. So now we're embedding an or statement within the if statement, and it's going to say or revision sequence equals 1, or revision sequence equals 3, return the revision sequence, otherwise return a space bar. As well, I should say an empty space. Now, it's not super critical if you're a little confused by these formulas, it's not super critical you understand them for the fact that I'm going to obviously, I have it written here. You'll see me typing them out, and I'll also include them in the video description. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a moment to really quickly kind of switch up our fake data in the project. We're going to switch it from being all just architecture issuances to be following these 5 examples. So the first one will be 100% CDs and so forth. And then I'm going to change all those values, and then we're going to meet back up after that's all done. All right, so let's look at what we just did. So first off, on the actual sheet list, we did change all of the headers here to what the new different paths that we're going to be trying to track. And a quick note is that we actually, I don't know if you noticed, but because we had the headers changed for both the issuance 1 as well as the issuance 1 with the X, I changed all the other headers back to nothing, just so that it wasn't confusing. Because if we only changed these, this would have still, been bulletin 2 or whatever it was. So we changed all that. And then what I did is I went ahead and I created a starting view. Now, a starting view isn't something that's in the sample project, and this isn't really a starting view or anything like that type of tutorial, but I always like to have a starting view on all my projects. That way it's a drafting view that's like a landing page, gives you information about the project. The sample project, of course, just opens you up to the, title sheet, which is another really good compromise where you don't have to hold a separate drafting view. The reason why I like the drafting view, though, is I added in this little issuance tracker. Now, what this is doing is it's actually just giving us a huge lay of the land and tracking for everyone in the project to understand where we are, next deadline, all of that stuff. So here we can see revision sequence number. And so what that's going to be is this is going to be essentially, and these are all just text boxes. This isn't a schedule or anything like that. But if we go up to revision, you can see sequence right there, on the left, sequence 1, 2, 3, 4. These actually don't even have the zeros before it. So I can actually just, let's simplify this just to sequence, and then we can actually simplify these to not have that in the front. The issuance number here, that's our shared parameter, which is connected to the sheet. So that's talking about these issuances right here, this shared parameter. And so this is what we were saying, where essentially this sequence is always going to equal that 1. This is going to equal that 2. Now, occasionally it happens where somebody messes up, something happens, things get out of order, where this, ends up getting a little bit mixed up. And that's especially true when, projects just are fast and crazy and different deadlines happening and all that. And that's where this tracker really, really starts to come into play. Hopefully this is general as like a boring schedule, but sometimes it actually does start to really actually help document things. Here we can see the dates. These dates are, of course, going to match whatever is located in the revision spot here, as well as then whatever is on the header for the sheet list up here. Revision number is something we'll talk about in probably the next segment of the video, but when you're tagging a bubble, or I should say you're bubbling something and then tagging it, what do you actually want it to be? And then that also is going to play into here. These are actually pretty well... pretty much related. So let's do that to make sure that those are related. So per project or per sheet. And then here, this is going to give you really the first big look at what we're kind of talking about. So this path tracking. So I'm labeling them as A, B, C just to kind of make it easy and not introduce like a 1, 2, 3 again. So track A being architecture, you can see this is going to be the 100% CDs. Then we have the bulletin. So, and what I like about this is that this actually gives us the ability to pretend like, this is actually going to be not just for ARC, but also part of the permit set. Exactly. That's not too common. I always like to split these up and delineate perfectly to have their own paths, but if you need to, it's there. And then the title and purpose. And then I always like to have just like a little bit of a highlight right here, just letting everyone know when they're first pop into the project, what they are doing. Now, or what issuance we're on. Now I should change the starting view here to the drafting view, starting view, and there we go. So let's go ahead and first tackle the schedules. The schedules, like I said, was going to be easier. So here we got our sheet list, and this is of course not what we want anymore. We don't want a lot of this. Well, I'm going to actually rename this. I'm going to do sheet list working. And this has everything in it so I can see it all nice and easy. And then what I can do is I'm going to duplicate this, and then this can be renamed as architecture. So this is going to be the architecture sheet list. Now, when I go into here, I know let me just temporarily go back to here. I know that my architecture issuances are issuance 1, 3, and 4. 2 and 5 are not part of it. So what I can actually do is take 2 and I can remove it. Take 5 and I can remove it. And now if I go, that's really all there is to it. Now we'll get into a future video how to actually properly filter and, make sure that we're only showing things that are issued and all that stuff. That's for a future kind of video. But right now, this is really all you need to do. So let's go ahead and just drop this onto the sheet. And you can see that that's construction, bulletin, bulletin. So this is where you do. And now there's different types of strategies for, if you wanted to issue this for architecture versus your permit set. Some people keep one title page, all the same title page, and then they just swap, like they'll just delete this, throw the new one on for, you know, your permit set or whatever. Other people will actually keep separate title sheets for every single, you know, different one. So you just print a different sheet. Those are kind of really, I would call those like office kind of preference. So let's go ahead and make the other ones. Let's go ahead and do duplicate, rename, and we're going to do permit. And I'm going to duplicate the architecture. And what you're actually going to see here is that wouldn't have been the right thing to do, because now the issuance isn't in here anymore. So it lost its formatting, it's lost its headline, it's lost all that stuff. So instead, what I would do is I'm going to delete this, duplicate off of the working. And I haven't specifically messed with the working because I want to really use that to make these other two. So I'm going to duplicate that twice, make this one permit, make this one landmarks. So landmarks we know is just going to be, the first one is going to be for 5. And then permit is, I believe, and if you don't remember, you can always come in here. Permit is 2. And so now I'm going to actually just delete the working view because I don't need that working one on here anymore. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to pop all of these right next to each other. And there's our different sheet lists for the different permit set, landmark set. So now, like I said, we're not really getting into right now in this part of the video how to make sure, like, oh, the plans weren't part of landmarks, so why are they still showing up? We will filter those out. Really, it's not terribly hard. You can obviously just do equals X for this, and you'll see it'll only show the X's. You could also do, instead of the X, you could do the 5 equals yes, just because then that'd be the same thing. We're actually going to do a different way of actually calculating that, where it's a little bit more future flexible beyond that, because what ends up happening is, if for something like this, because we wouldn't want A301 to show up here, so a lot of what you get is you get people being like equals that, and you then run into an issue, and you know, equals that, like, because it's not and, it's or. So we're going to actually create something that'll be future flexible for the architecture in the next part of the video. But before we do that, let's start talking about our title blocks. So let's just pretend like this is for the architecture. So we only want to show 1, 3, and 4 here. So this is where that if statement's going to come in. So let's go ahead and edit this. And if we look up here, this is the schedules. This is the revision schedule right here. And notice how if we go up to here, this does not look like the other schedules. Notice how it's missing the filter field right here, which is really the frustration and where this is all coming from. Because it's missing it, this is where that whole workaround comes into play. So what we're actually going to do is, right now we're scheduling revision number, revision description, revision date, revision sequence. I personally don't like how any of this is really set up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a pause right here. I'm going to reorient this all how I like it to be oriented, which I like basically number on the left, the date, the description, then the revision delta on the right. So I'm going to go ahead and create that. I don't want to spend too much time on it though. So I'm going to go ahead and change some of those things, and then we'll get back to it. So what I just did is I went in and just grabbed the Imperial title block family. That's an E size, 34 by 44. I changed it really quickly just to 36 by 48. Not going to worry too much about, you know, formatting or, you know, fixing stuff like that, or even renaming the family. That's not what this is about. But what it does is it gives us a larger sheet so that there's a little bit more breathing room on this, which is nice. And then what I ended up doing is, in the family itself, I ended up switching around how this is working. So first thing that I did was really, I'm adding in these numbers. These are static numbers, and what this represents isn't the issuance number and it's not the revision number. Instead, this is quite literally, it's something that you don't even need in your title block if you don't want to. It's just so that when you get, 7 of them in a row, you'll see, and you can easily see that sheet's been issued 7 times, or the 6th issuance of that sheet for this path is this one or whatever. Then we've got date, description, and if I'm being real, normally what I do is I take these lines and I actually get rid of the grid lines here, and I make this kind of basically an invisible schedule. I'm not going to deal with any of that right now. And then what we do have is we got the revision right here, shown by the triangle, which is how you tag the revisions, or just, it also kind of represents like delta. And then the description here. So when we pull that back into the project, we can see that we still have what we, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in a row. And so now let's start doing the workaround to only get it to show 1, 3, and 4. So first things first is I'm going to just close out some of that stuff. All right, and so when we look at our schedule here, and we pop this open, we got a couple of different things to note. So the first to note is that we have actually 4 things scheduled, even though we're only showing essentially 3 right here. If we go through, we can see that the revision sequence is a hidden field, and that's because the revision sequence is actually how we're sorting it. So what we're actually going to be doing is creating a calculated parameter off of all of these, and we're going to basically hide these 3 and show the other ones. So let's go ahead and create the calculated parameters. Now I'm going to go ahead and just create every single one of these calculated parameters, and I'm just going to say calculated, let's just start with the date, click OK. Calculated description. They need to be text parameters is the most important thing. Did I do that for that one? Yeah, I do. Calculated revision sequence. I believe that's a text one as well. So we can move these up. Now, the revision number is really the only one that we're going to not mess with. That's going to always show up right here. We're going to show it. You can see if we go over to the formatting and look at it, it's not hidden center. It's all, that's really going to be the only one that we're actually still using. So let's go ahead and do the date one first. So if we go back to the sorting, let's actually edit this. And remember, nothing really changed here. And what we're going to end up doing here is we're going to write in our statement here from earlier. And we're going to write in an if statement, then an or statement. And what we're going to do is we're going to utilize the revision sequence. Because remember, it knows that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so we want to say, well, we want only 1, 3, 4, right? So we're going to say if revision sequence is equal to 1, and because it's an OR value, it's going to say or revision sequence is equal to, I think it's 3 for us, or revision sequence equal to 4. And then we want to basically close that OR statement. So that's the conditional format right here. So this is the condition that we're trying to basically state. And it's an OR statement. So this is our, if 1 is less than 2, return this. If 2 is greater than 3, whatever it is, this is the condition that we're kind of checking for. And then if it is true, we want to show the revision date. Now, keep in mind, I need to spell this exactly because this is actually a parameter right here. Same with this. So if you, accidentally do something like that, it most likely will kick you back an error, which we can just test that out in a second. And if it's false, we're just going to do spacebar and close it. And so I think this should, I'm going to just copy this in case it, yeah. So revision date, you can see it's not the scheduled field because it's missing the spacebar there. So if we, or this, I should say the space in between the words, click OK. Now click OK. You'll see it added a couple of columns here, and let's just load this into the project just to see what happens. So what we're seeing right here is I'm telling it for this date. So this is actually the new, this is the date calculated right here. So this right here, this column is the date that's calculated. And so what you can see is what we said is if it's 1, 3, or 4, show us the date. If not, show us a space bar. So there's actually, technically speaking, there's, you know, I don't know how we should represent that, but there's actually a space that is being, you know, scheduled right there. That's writing a space. And we can see that in another way. If we go back here and we go back into the revision schedule and we take that calculated date and we change that to, I don't know, XXX right there, click OK, load it in. You'll see that XXX pops up in both of those spots right there. Now, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing the same thing for the description as well. This is going to be the calculated description. And what we're going to say is the same exact thing, because basically we don't care about the permit set or the landmark set right now. So let's go back into here. And this is where we can actually reuse what we just did. So we're going to actually take this, we're going to copy it, and we're going to go to the description, and we're going to paste it. Now, the thing to change here though isn't the conditional format or the conditional statement. It's the output. We don't want the date anymore. We want the description. Oops, no. I can type, click OK, click OK. Now let's load that in. So here you can see we've now also got that same effect for the description. And now we want to do the same thing for the sequence. So let's go back into here, revision, calculated, and we don't want that. We want the revision sequence. This actually might need to be a an integer. I have to check. Yeah, so this needs to actually be an integer. So that was something I messed up. So instead of a text for this type, because the revision sequence itself is an integer, that's the data format, we're going to need to make this a, let's just leave this as old for a second. We're going to have to make a new one. So we're going to actually make a new one right here, calculated revision sequence. And this is where we need to be making it an integer. We're going to go here. And note that this not only can't be that, you can't write like 93 or anything in there because the quotation marks actually means that it's a text value rather than an integer. So we just want this to be a high value. Now this value could be whatever you want, so long as it's going to always be higher than your actual revision sequence. So typically, you know, if you have 20 issuances in the project, that'll be 20 totals, you know. So if you wrote like 999, I hope for your sake that that's going to be higher than the amount of issuances you have. I always just write like a little bit extra. So 9999. Click OK. Let's go up and we can actually delete this mistake of ours. So we can just delete that right there. Click OK. Now we're going to load this into the project and let's see what happens. So essentially what we did here is we said 19999 because it's not 1, 3, or 4. 3, 4 thing. So essentially, like what we're showing here is we're essentially telling it to put in custom values for permit and landmarks. Now let's go back into here. And instead of sorting by revision sequence, let's sort by the calculated revision sequence. Now click OK, and now let's load this in. And so what you'll see here, and this is really one of kind of the tricky things that's happening, is if you noticed before we had 2 entries here, now we only have 1. And that's because on our schedule, we are not actually, if we go back to sorting grouping, we're not itemizing. If I click itemized right here and I load this in, you'll see another one pop in right there. So you can see those 2 pop in. But if we undo that, what's happening is, if everyone kind of knows this from Revit, you know, I think it's 2022 and earlier, if the data is different, it shows a blank value. And I think 2023, they've introduced a kind of parentheses varies. So you might get this if you were to like be doing it, following along exactly, it might say this in the, and you were in 2023, might say that right there, and also like that right there. That doesn't matter because we're not going to end up scheduling those anyway. But what we have now is it collapsed everything because these are all the same. And notice how now we only have 1, 3, 4 shown here, which is perfect for what we want. So let's go ahead and change these back to just space bars. So it's technically going to be a space bar that's, you know, scheduled there. It's just they're all stacked on top of each other. And because it's obviously a space bar, nothing is going to show up. So really, we're not so much as hiding it. I should say, like, not making it disappear or not scheduling it so much as we are hiding it. It's kind of a little bit of, you know, that's why it's a workaround. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go back to this calculated. We're going to change this from the X's just to space bars. Description back to space bars. Click OK. Now we're going to go to formatting, and we're actually not going to schedule any of these. We don't need those. And we don't need to schedule the revision sequence anymore. So if we click OK, this is our new schedule. Let's just do something like that. Now let's load this in. Sure, let's overwrite. All right, and so, oops, we need to change one last little thing here. The formatting for the date, which I normally wouldn't actually even do this. I'd make the date its own thing and make, like I said, but for just right now, we're going to do this. All right. And so this is actually, I apologize if you heard the thunder that's kind of happening outside. So this is actually, ooh, I don't like the, there we go. Give us a little bit more room. Still not enough. This is why you should always work with your template if you can. And obviously I'm not doing this for an office right now, so I'm not working with the template. You should be building your own template right now. So what you can see here is, if I delete all these guys, this is actually the calculated date, the calculated description. And as I said, this is still scheduling other values right here. And it's actually still itemizing those because I believe I might still have itemize every instance. So I have to undo that. Let's load this back in. There. And that's literally all there is to it. So right now what we have is, you can see we're only showing 1, 3, and 4. Now a quick note is, let's go back to our starting view and let's look at what we actually want these to be scheduled as. So the first one should be not have an actual revision tied to it. Now, when I say revision number, this, and I could actually probably clarify this a little bit more, this is actually going to be the delta number. So let's go ahead and just create a little symbol for this for everyone to know. Oops. That's the actual delta number, right? Because that's the number you're tagging with. Now we do want 1 and 2, and you can see I wrote this in. We'll go into this in another, part of the video, but it's per project. So let's go ahead and view revisions. And you can see, because I'm issuing in this, quote unquote, like status of the project, I could actually set this to be none and this to be none. Because remember, shouldn't be 1, 3, 4 to match the sequence. This is actually also going to be none. This should be 1 and 2. So that revision number right there, you can see now matches up 1 and 2 for this bulletin 1 and bulletin 2. So if we go back to here, we can now see that that's matching. And so that's where I was saying earlier, where this number just refers to the number of lines here, not necessarily the actual revision delta. And what you can see here is, if I were to, I don't think I have any of these issued yet. So if I was to create a revision cloud, and I put it on, say, bulletin 1, and then I don't know if there is no revision cloud tag. Let's really quickly load one in. So you see that you can see that that's tagging as 1, and that's 1. And then if I was just to copy this bubble down and change the sequence to, say, 4, that's where it now says 2. So that's how that all works. Now, you might be saying, okay, that's great, but how do I get these ones to work? Well, that's where it's kind of up to you for your office. You can either choose one of two different really main paths. One is you could have a title block that is saved for your architectural issuances, your, path B permit issuances, your path C permit issuances. Maybe that's what you want. Or you simply just go into edit family, and then you kind of come in here, and then you just simply edit this date to be whatever you want. And for, if you just wanted to show 2, you would just say 2, and you can actually leave the or in there. Click OK like that. It'll still work without it. Load in, overwrite, and now it's not going to show anything because it's all discombobulated. But now that'll only show 2. So what I like to also do here is if I edit this now, I'm going to close this out so it opens up the latest. I can take this calculated date value, or formula, I should say, and I can simply write it right here. So this can become my calculated date formula. And then I could, copy this down a couple of times. This could be sequence. And then I can come in here, copy this, revision sequence. And you'll see the slight nuances of how this is working once you do it this way as well. And then this would be description. Come back here, edit, description. So here we can see really how it's actually working. And I'm going to actually take this little filled region down here. We're going to say, so there's the or statement in yellow. And so that's return if true is going to be this little piece right there. And then the return if false is going to be right there. So you can see that for the date, we're returning the date if it's true. For the sequence, returning the sequence if it's true. The description, the description. But the really only difference here is then be this revision sequence. We need to just basically make sure that it's at the bottom of the list. So we need it to be higher than whatever the actual revision sequence is. Now, this is where, we're on 5 right now, but we'll go into, if we're going to be making our next one as bulletin, maybe this is bulletin 3 all of a sudden. How do we do that? Well, all you do is you just add to your area right here. So you would do revision sequence equals 5. And that would be your new value because we now want to include the 5th one in there. So I think I'm going to stop it right there in terms of how to do this. What I'm going to do in the next is I'm going to actually just kind of spend some time cleaning this up. What I like to typically do is I actually create a little bit of a chart for basically what different path it is and all the different revision sequences. So you'll be able to see how these play out. And then it's all right here. So I really hope, there's plenty more to talk about. And I think I'm going to do another follow-up video because this is getting quite long on how to really have a couple of tips and tricks. So if this is something that you're implementing for your office or for yourself, I really highly would recommend you watch the tips and tricks video, which I'll post soon. That way it'll just help you get a little bit better kind of handle on doing things. And it's just a couple of different methods and workflows to essentially make your life a little bit easier and make sure everything stays kind of coordinated. Because as of right now, we obviously have two different things to coordinate between. We have the sequence as well as the issuance. So yeah, really appreciate you being here if you've made it this far. We'll get to the last little fast part and then close it up from here. All right, so there's the three different formulas that we need in the title block or separate title blocks. Appreciate you all watching. I will host this to Arc Overflow if you would like to download this file and look at the formulas and stuff, and it'll all be hosted over there. So go check it out. Thanks for watching. Till next time.